This is Fred Richani of TSC News right here on MNN. We've got a jam-packed show for y'all. We have Paul Lazenby fresh off of his Supergirl appearance. Actor, stuntman, former pro wrestler, and mixed martial artist. He's here to talk about the wild ride to success. We're also going to talk to our buddy Scott Anderson, the People's Podcaster, who's going to present us some random wrestling facts regarding wrestlers who have done mixed martial arts. And we're going to take a special look back on Throwback Thursday from a clip, an interview that I did with the guy who had a little dust-up with the dude by the name of WWE Hall of Famer and new Raw General Manager, Kurt Angle. But first, I just want to say thank you to The Undertaker and congratulations on a wonderful career. He recently retired after WrestleMania 33. Thank you so much for the memories and representing everything great about pro wrestling storytelling done at the highest level. I also want to send a special shout out to my main man, a friend of TSC News, Jim Ross, WWE Hall of Famer. The legend is back in WWE. He has signed a 2-year deal, so maybe you won't see him on some Monday Night Raws. Maybe you won't see him on some SmackDown Lives, but you better believe you're going to see him a whole lot on the WWE Network. You're going to see him a whole lot on WrestleMania these next couple years, and hopefully a few more pay-per-views along the way. Now, what does that mean for his New Japan Pro Wrestling on Access TV gig? New Japan airs every Friday night on Access. That remains to be seen, but I am certainly happy that good old JR is back home. And we're going to make ourselves right at home with a longtime friend, longtime guest of TSC News, Paul the Mauler Lazenby. If you don't know about this guy, you're about to get to know him. Believe me, this is one story you definitely want to hear. We have right here via Skype, Paul the Mauler Lazenby. He is a man with more job titles than Ric Flair has world titles. We're going to talk to him about wrestling, mixed martial arts, his recent appearance on Supergirl, and much, much more. Paul, how's it going, man?
Awesome, man. It hasn't been this good in a very long time, so anybody who catches me complaining is entitled to punch me in the back of the head at least once.
Now, before we get started, off the top of your head, can you name all your job titles?
Oh, dude, you're catching me flat-footed. Let's see. Actor, stuntman, roving correspondent for the Killing the Town podcast, author, MMA trainer, Muay Thai trainer. I know there's one or two more in there, but I've forgotten right now.
You've been getting a lot of buzz on Twitter the last few years, really, from your book, When We Were Bouncers, your recent appearances in The Marine 4. You did some work for Star Trek. You even were in Deadpool, sort of, which we'll talk about. And you were recently on Supergirl, although you were a bit unrecognizable compared to how we see you right now. How was that experience?
It was a lot of fun, man. I had so much fun on that one. It was a full prosthetic deal. I was playing an alien stolen art dealer named Mandrax, if you can wrap your brain around that. But it involved 3.5 hours of two makeup artists working on me to get me into the prosthetics. And of course, once you're in it, you're in it. And that's where a lot of people turn down that kind of work because they get claustrophobic. But I really dug it. And I also got to spend about 14 hours of that day beating the unholy crap out of my buddy Mike Lewinson, who was doubling Guardian. So it was a double bonus for me.
Now, you said with prosthetics it takes a while to do. People get claustrophobic. What was your first time doing it?
The first time of any kind of prosthetics work was, I believe, 2002. I was doing an English toy commercial they have a line over there called Action Man, which is kind of like the G.I. Joe dolls of the 1970s. And they were debuting a new villain called Antifreeze, and that was me. So it was actually kind of cool because I was working on a show called Andromeda playing some crazy tattooed up cage fighter. And they had to grab me off set as soon as I was done, 14 hours on that set, and then take me up to Whistler from Burnaby, BC. I got like 2 hours sleep, and then down to the lobby of the hotel where they had a makeup station set up there, and then like 2 hours to get me into all that gear, and then out to a helicopter landing pad, and we took off to a glacier outside of Whistler and shot for the day. So that was one of my more memorable jobs. That was fun.
That's pretty damn cool. Now, some of you may know Paul from Killing the Town, the popular podcast on Podcast One with Lance Storm and Cyrus. You've also appeared on Steve Austin's show, Chris Jericho's show. You're actually Steve Austin's personal stuntman, but before all that, You were a wrestler. What came first for you, your love for wrestling or martial arts?
Oh, definitely wrestling. I never wanted to be a legitimate fighter. I always wanted to be a professional wrestler. So my first love was powerlifting and strongman, and it still is. I still do it to this day. But then I moved into wrestling because I've been a wrestling fan since I was a little kid and love that too. And I had two major goals as a professional wrestler. One was to get to a major organization, whether it's WWE, WCW, whatever, and make a full-time living. And the other one was to wrestle in Japan at least once. I saw an old, dating myself, but I saw an old VHS tape of Japanese wrestling in the late 80s, I think. And it captivated me. Like, I have to go there, I have to wrestle there. And the fighting, actually, I fell over sideways into. I was at a wrestling show in Detroit for Insane Championship Wrestling in Detroit. Shout out to A.T. Huck, and thank you to the late Malcolm Monroe for taking me into that organization. And I met this lady named Phyllis Lee, who was a friend of the Malenkos, and she was a friend of Carl Gotch, who was one of the trainers of the elite Japanese fighters in the Pancrase organization. And those of you who aren't familiar with the name, between 93 and about 97, Pancrase was the number one MMA group in the world. So this is around 96, and I just my way into fighting there, not because I had any experience. I didn't even wrestle on the high school team or anything. But I just wanted to go to Japan so bad. I was willing to take an ass kicking to do it. And that's exactly what happened. But I guess I took an entertaining enough ass kicking. They let me live and train at the dojo for a while. I fought the world champion, and I just kind of worked my way into to fighting sports without even really meaning to.
That's very cool. Well, not the punch in the face part doesn't seem very cool, but I would imagine the Japanese experience with Pancrase was interesting because from what I understand, at least back in that era, it was not only mixed martial arts, but they incorporated a lot of elements of pro wrestling.
Well, they considered themselves to be pro wrestlers. I mean, I remember the first time I got in the ring, it was sprung like a wrestling ring. It had 3 ropes. It was a professional wrestling ring. And I remember thinking that was kind of curious. But then when you look back at it, you realize they fought real fights under pro wrestling rules. You get the open hand strike to the head, which was a pro wrestling rule up until recently when WWE started allowing closed fists. You could punch to the body. There were rope escapes, stuff like that. So it was very much a group where they booked it like a wrestling organization, which is part of the reason that I got in, is because they had never had a Canadian fight there before. So, I sent in my pictures, and at the time I was, 28 years old, and I was a muscular, good-looking kid. So I thought, okay, we'll bring him over, and one of our guys will kick his ass, and then we got a Canadian's head to hang on the mantle alongside all the other nations that have been represented here. And so they very much had the pro wrestling mindset, down to the point that it's been brought up a million times before that, Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki, the two major players in Pancrase, they were so far ahead of the curve at the time that they could make a fight go whichever way they wanted it to go most of the time without the cooperation of the other person. So you could be in there thinking you're fighting for real, and they're kind of stringing you along and making a show out of it and then finishing you off at their leisure. And it's that mindset that made Pancrase what it was. It made it such a great storytelling organization most of the time.
Now, besides job titles, okay, I've looked at your IMDb resume, and it is ridiculous. Now, this is around, 97, 98 when you're at Pancrase?
Yes, 97.
Okay, at what point did you say, okay, this getting punched in the face stuff is all right, but I want to try my hand in acting and stunt work?
Well, again, that happened by accident. And it bears out what I always say about not saying no to things. I mean, if you get an opportunity to do something crazy and it's entirely outside of your wheelhouse, but you think there might just be a chance I can pull this off, or I just want to experience that, do it. And that's exactly how I ended up in most of the stuff that I've done. I was terrified. I wasn't a real fighter. I was a street fighter at best. But I went to Japan and I fought some of the best fighters in the world, and it ended up being a great thing for me. And the same thing happened in stunts. What happened was my career was petering out in Japan. I learning on the fly, so I lost all my fights. I didn't start winning fights until later on. And my buddy Dr. Luther, who is a name that anybody who's familiar with Japanese wrestling from the 90s will know, he was a huge star with the FMW promotion. And really one of those elite talents that just slipped through the cracks, really should have ended up in a major promotion. And just because the chips didn't fall in his direction, he didn't. But he's a huge, huge talent and a very good friend of mine. And he was living in Vancouver, and he used to bug me all the time and say, look, dude, you're living in Kitchener, Ontario. There's nothing going on out there. Move out here. And he I decided to do it when there was nothing going on for me in Japan anymore, and there was active wrestling going on in Vancouver. At the time, Ontario was dead, so I moved out as a last stab at making it as a professional wrestler. And it was just exactly around the time when I was realizing that window had kind of shut for me as far as making it in a large scale organization, that I just happened to meet a guy named James Bamford in the gym that we both trained at. And he was a stunt coordinator, stunt performer, still is, now director. And he was coordinating a kids show called Los Luchadors, which was about Mexican pro wrestler superheroes. And we call him Bam Bam. Bam Bam hates pro wrestling with a passion. He despises it. He can't stand it. So he didn't want to do the homework. And he asked around the gym and to see if there was a pro wrestler training there. And we started talking, and he brought me into the business that way. So that was my foothold. But yeah, it all happened peripherally, just from continuing to throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And sometimes what sticks is something entirely unexpected.
You've had a lot of great breaks in your career, especially lately, but was there one early on when you started doing acting and stunt work where you said, man, I got some momentum here. This is something I could continue to do for a sustained amount of time?
It was almost right off the bat, just because I was lucky enough to start. I wore several hats in the acting and stunt industry to start with. So actually my first job on set was on a wire team. And I'm sure if you've seen any kind of behind the scenes footage when they've got performers hanging up on wires doing aerial stunts, you'll often see that the wire goes through an overhead mounted pulley and then back down, and it's attached to a rope that a dude is pulling. Sometimes it's a machine, but a lot of the time it's just a person pulling. That was my first job in the industry, but it was on a show that had wire gags every single episode. So almost right out of the gate, between that job and working as a bouncer at the time, I was able to make enough money between the two of them to at least keep the wolf away from the door. When I really started getting momentum, though, was about 3 years later. Business was starting to pick up. It was about 2003. And The Chronicles of Riddick, the movie, came to town. And the second most influential stunt coordinator in my career, Dean Cho, who's another guy that's just been backing me through my entire career, he took over that show. And he just said, look, don't take any other work. I'm going to lock you down in the show. And that's the first movie I worked on from the first day of rehearsal to the last day of wrap. And that was just such a successful year. I started thinking, okay, maybe it's time to start considering myself a full-time stuntman now.
Man, there's only one Paul Lazenby. We'll be back with the second half of our Paul Lazenby interview later in the show. But this is the Wrestling Meets MMA edition of TSC News. And we have right here the People's Podcaster, the one and only Scott Anderson. There's only one Scott Anderson. And for whatever reason, Scott is bringing some random Wrestling Meets MMA facts in black and white. Scott, what the hell are you doing, man?
Fred, guys look tougher in black and white.
How? Why?
It worked for Brando.
I have no comeback for that. So let's get started.
All right. This week, we're doing the MMA edition of TSC News. So I have some interesting wrestling/MMA facts for you. First, I want to ask you a question, Fred. What do the names Dave Bautista, Nathan Jones, Kid Cash, Jushin Thunder Liger, CM Punk, and Dr. Death Steve Williams all have in common?
They're all a lot tougher than you and me.
That is true. But the correct answer that we were looking for on the panel is they are a combined 1-5 in MMA fights. Dave Bautista is the only one victorious. He lasted 4 minutes of the first round before he got his win. Now, here's a fun fact, which is actually not really a fun fact. In the 5 combined losses, those wrestlers turned MMA fighters lasted an average of 97.6 seconds. So,
well, you said 97.6 seconds, not minutes.
Basically a minute and a half.
So about a minute and a half longer than you and I would last in a cage.
Absolutely. Which, hey, props to them.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show that maybe it's not for everybody.
True.
This, of course, was not the result that you had hoped for, but you talked all along about this was about the journey as well. So now that it's over, at least for the moment, didn't come up your way. How are you feeling about the whole process right now?
The process was magical. I'm just disappointed. I'm beating myself up way more than I got beat up. I'm supremely disappointed, but the answer to your question is, aside from the outcome, wouldn't change anything for the world.
Another thing was like, well, CM Punk get out there and embarrass himself. Well, he looked terrible, and I would think a lot of people would call this a lopsided loss. But are you proud of what you put out there today?
I don't think. There's probably an alternate reality where I win and I'm still disappointed in myself. That's just who I am. I'm just really, really hard on myself. I lost, and it sucks, and it was lopsided, and it's upsetting. But I know I'm better than that.
On the flip side, some of the more successful pro wrestlers turned MMA fighters are, believe it or not, Alberto Del Rio, Sean O'Hare, if you remember him. How's about Shinsuke Nakamura, just recently brought up to SmackDown Live? Bobby Lashley, of course, fighting for Bellator currently. And of course, we cannot forget Brock Lesnar, last appeared at UFC 200. How's about this one? Fred Bam Bam Bigelow had one MMA fight in Japan, but he later said that it was a staged fight. However, he took the paycheck, so you can't really blame the guy for that too much. And Bob Sapp, if you remember him, he was in the 2005 remake of The Longest Yard. He was the first and only to date African-American IWGP heavyweight champion. Believe it or not, he defended and defeated Shinsuke Nakamura. So that's kind of an interesting fact for you.
Wow, and that was back in New Japan Pro Wrestling at JPW, which you can currently watch weekly Friday nights on Access TV.
However, it does go both ways. There were a few MMA fighters turned WWE/TNA wrestlers. How's about the name Josh Barnett? He recently debuted on Impact Wrestling. If you remember the name Daniel Puder, he was an ex-WWE Tough Enough winner. I remember him for being in the Royal Rumble many years back and just getting totally destroyed by the 4 or 5 men that were involved in that. And I remember Bob Holly specifically just taking him to the woodshed, so to speak.
Daniel Puder, that's an interesting name because he was actually a former TSC News guest. And since you brought him up, let's take a look back at the time he had a little confrontation with new WWE Hall of Famer Kurt Angle. Your incident with Kurt Angle, for some younger fans that may not know, I believe Angle had some type of amateur wrestling challenge or grappling challenge years ago, I believe back in late 2004 on SmackDown when you guys were doing the $1 Million Tough Enough. Yeah. And Angle kind of dominated all the contestants, and you were up. He took you down. I guess he tried to hurt you, and you instinctively locked in a Kimura and almost broke his arm and made him tap out until Jimmy Corderas counted the 1, 2, 3, even though your shoulders weren't down on the mat. What was that like in the heat of the moment? And I'd imagine the aftermath was pretty wild.
Yeah, I thought it would be different. I mean, I think that, when I got done, trying to snap his arm off, he didn't know what to do. I think he was just stunned, literally. He didn't know what to say, what to do, because he just got caught and almost snapped his arm. Now, what happened was we were wrestling. He's definitely stronger than me. Pushed me against the ropes, got behind me. I key locked him, pulled him into a Kimura, and then I was going to snap his arm. I just wanted to tap him out. Okay, maybe I want to snap his arm. But the idea was that he just broke. If you take it back about 3 to 5 minutes in the deal, he wrestled Chris Naraki, which was one of my buddies on SmackDown, and on the Tough Enough, and he broke 3 of his ribs. So we went out there and did this competition, up downs, and we ran sprints, ate pasta, ran more sprints, and then we went out there and did this up down competition. They picked Chris because they said get the blonde guy out. We were both blonde. So I went out. He wrestled Chris, but he knew I really won. And so he threw me in there. He was like, anybody else? And I raised my hand. I think that's the day that everybody started rooting for me. And my whole team started rooting. I mean, not my team, but the contestants started rooting against me. So it was pretty interesting to see how fast people can turn on you because, man, and they were out partying all the time. I was trying to go to sleep, get my rest, get my workouts in, eat the right food. So it was pretty cool to be able to see how hard I was working. And It was nuts. It was a good time though.
Good time. All snapping Kurt Angle's arm, and you guys had beef for a long time. Is it true that Dana White tried to book you versus Kurt Angle sometime? I believe probably would have been around like 06, 07?
Yeah, so I was on Tough Enough. Actually, the first time I was on Tough Enough. I think I just won Tough Enough, and they called me the UFC guy or something like that on Tough Enough. So I won Tough Enough. Dana called Bob, or Bob called Dana, I forget, and they said, hey, we want you on the first reality show. And they offered me like $500 a week. And I was like, you guys are crazy. I'm being guaranteed $5,000 a week here. But I did seriously consider it. So I stuck with WWE, because I loved it. I was having fun with it, and I was, it was good money.
Yeah. Now,
but the second time, then he flew us out to Vegas after I got done with after I got done with my contract, my WWE, and then he offered another deal, and we turned that down too. So I went to Strikeforce.
Scott's segments get a little bit more unique each week. Not complaining, just saying. Now, back to part 2 of our interview with Paul the Mauler Lazenby. And going through all the adversity he did in pro wrestling and MMA, and let's face it, adversity is like your middle name when you're going through those respective fields. There's a very small window of opportunity. The training, the conditioning is pretty damn intense. There's no real easy day at the office. Did that experience MMA and pro wrestling help you to deal with stunt work and also to deal with some of the BS in Hollywood?
Absolutely. I mean, pro wrestling is an incredibly corrupt business in a lot of ways. There's a lot that's great about it too. I love it to this day. But yeah, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of scams that go on in professional wrestling. So there was really nothing in the film and television industry that surprised me. You can't out sleaze pro wrestling. So it really did prepare me a lot. And then MMA, when I came in, actually, a lot of people were scared of me because this is, again, I got in the industry in the year 2000, and people weren't that familiar with MMA. They just knew it was this crazy no holds barred stuff that animals did to each other in locked cages and pits and things like that. And so I think that I ended up I had gone through a lot tougher training than I was going to experience on set. And even though I received some horrendous injuries on set, I never had a tougher day on set than I had in the Pankers dojo. I can tell you that for nothing.
What's the worst injury you ever had on set?
It was actually my very first day on set. It was my first stunt, rather. It wasn't my first day on set, but the first time I was ever in front of the cameras. And it wasn't even my first day. It was the very first take. The first time they were rolling the cameras on me in my entire career. And it was actually an actor named Holt McCallany. And it was a total mistake. But, Holt would get very excited during his fight scenes. And he was also training with Boss Rutan. So he knew how to throw his punches and kicks to maximum effect. And it was just one of those things where he got a little too close. And I was, because of the choreography of the scene, I was moving my head into his fist, which more than doubled the power of the punch. And it completely destroyed my entire orbital bone in this eye and damaged tore the retina, I think, and did permanent vision damage that I'm still suffering today. So it took 3 laser surgeries and 1 actual invasive surgery where they had to take the eye right out of my skull to repair some of the damage. And that would definitely qualify as my worst day on set.
Oh, man. Have you ever had a chance to find Holt and be like, hey, buddy, how's everything going?
Well, thing is, he was around town for a little while longer after that. So, yeah, I mean, it was an accident. It happens on set like that. And, especially when the actor's really getting into the role and they're really excited. And then sometimes things can happen. So, I've been hit by other actors too. And it's part of the job. I don't think Holt walked on that set that day saying, I'm going to bust Lazenby's head open. So, I'm not going to hold any grudge against him at all.
You're also pretty famous for being a stuntman for a guy you kind of look like. Stone Cold Steve Austin, WWE Hall of Famer. How'd you get hooked up with Steve?
Well, it actually started when he came to Vancouver to make a film called Damage. And that was a bare-knuckle underground fighting ring movie. And I actually wasn't hired to be his double. That went to a gentleman named Kevin Rushton, who's a great stunt guy from out in Ontario. But Actually, Steve accidentally broke my nose during the filming of that. Again, total accident. If anybody knows how to throw a punch and not hurt somebody, it's Steve. So that's proof that it can happen to anybody. You get throwing punches back and forth. I've clipped people by accident too. It happens. But working on that film, a lot of people were kind of looking at Steve and looking at me and looking at Steve and looking at me and realizing that I was actually a better physical match for Steve than Kevin was. So it turns out Steve had signed a deal with a production company that wanted to shoot all their movies in Vancouver. And there were like 4 or 5 movies I think they had on the deal. So the next time he came to town, my buddy Laurel Chartrand, he was the coordinator, and he called me up and brought me in, and the director agreed. So I started doubling Steve on the next movie, which is called The Stranger. And then I think we did 5 more movies after that, where he kept coming back. And, I really owe him a big debt of gratitude, because I think after The Stranger, he was supposed to come back for Hunt to Kill. And this has never happened to me before, but I didn't get a call from the stunt coordinator or the casting director or anybody like that. I got a call from Steve. And he said, look, I'm coming back, and you're my guy. So, if you're available, I want you to work on this movie. And that was really cool. It was a nice vote of confidence to have after having doubled him the previous time. And just an absolutely great dude. If I had to pick a singular career highlight from 17 years in the film and TV industry, it would be my run doubling Steve Austin.
What's the coolest thing about Steve Austin that fans don't know?
That the Steve you see on TV is the Steve you get, and that he has absolutely nothing to prove to himself or anybody else. The toughest guys, the legitimately toughest guys you're going to meet are the ones who aren't concerned with what other people think. They're not concerned with making sure everybody in the room knows they're tough. They're just nice to people that are nice to them. And if you're disrespectful to them, then they're disrespectful to you. And that's Steve to a T. Every day on every movie, no matter whether he was having a rough day or a good day, he was as nice to the production assistant wearing a reflective vest and watching cars in the parking lot as he was to the executive producer. That's always the guy you're going to get. And that's one of the things I appreciate about him.
Thanks so much to Paul Lazenby for the time. We had such an awesome time chatting with him that we're going to have him back next week to talk about motion capturing in video games. He did some work for a little franchise by the name of Gears of War, and he's going to chat about the state of WWE, including whether or not Roman Reigns is really the big dog. But until then, I appreciate the time. I appreciate you guys watching. If you want to see more, please log on to youtube.com/thesportscourier. You can subscribe and check out all our videos. You can also check us out on soundcloud.com/TSC News, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, you name it, we got it. You can follow us on Twitter @SportsCourier, @Fred Richani, @TSC News on Instagram. Until next time, everybody, as always, enjoy the matches.